So thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you for inviting us to participate in this conference today. We're extremely grateful. So today we're joining from Oasis Group, so we're an information management company looking at both physical and digital data archives. So today we're going to be discussing data management synergies across various industries. As a company, we work across a multitude of different sectors. So today, hopefully, we'll give you a bit of an insight into what we're doing across the different industries. So I'm Christine Booton. Here we go. I'm Christine Booton. I'm one of the senior account managers, specifically in the energy sector. I've been working in the energy sector for the last 14 years, previously with CGG, and my background is petrophysics, geology. We've also got with me today Andy.
Yeah, so I'm Andy Butcher. I'm a digital strategy and client director at Oasis Group. I've worked in the industry for 15 years. I've been working with clients on their physical and digital requirements, covering both public sector and private sector. So if we look at the public sector, I've worked with local government councils and authorities within the UK, also NHS trusts, and conversely, in the private sector, legal, finance and pharmaceutical.
Brilliant. So we're not too much of a distraction on today's talk. I am going to just turn the camera off for the majority of the presentation, but I will put it back on at the end for any questions that we may have. Okay, so synergies across industries and the different industries. What can we learn from these different industries and sectors? Where do the data management practices change? Where are there similarities across these? And what are the challenges that these industries are facing as well? So looking at this, so today we're going to talk about 3 different industries in particular. So we're going to look at medical records, NHS, GP surgeries, legal records and documents, and then the energy sector as well.
Okay. Yeah, so looking at the types of documents within the healthcare industry, obviously we know that there's patient data, there's personal information, there's corporate records, and there's a hybrid at the moment between physical and digital. Generally, when we look at data in the healthcare sector, there's this live period. So when a patient is on their inpatient journey, as it were, there's a high amount of activity for an 18-week period. So accessibility to those documents is absolutely critical during that time. Similar to the legal sector, a live matter will have high activity levels for a period of time, and ultimately until that's closed. What we see with the legal sector is there's a lot of physical documentation in that industry, primarily to do with the challenges of a wet signature or a requirement of a wet signature. But ultimately, there are long retention periods on documents such as wills and deeds, potentially to be retained indefinitely. So it all adds to the challenge of those sectors.
And I think the oil and gas sector is quite different in a sense of the activity that Andy's just spoken about for medical and legal records, where they're highly active new data that we're dealing with. When we start looking at oil and gas data, it's more legacy archives that we're still maintaining. The activity of new data coming in is generally surrounding cut-ins, core samples, whereas the paper archives have definitely reduced in the last 15, 20 years of what we're seeing that we're receiving. But around the data that is coming in for the oil and gas sector, it brings a whole new set of challenges along with it. A lot of this data is potentially samples, fluids that may contain flammable material and need specialised storage solutions. So it's a whole different ball game of types of data that we're looking at between these different industries. So there are common challenges, as we mentioned, that the industries all face. And I think each point that we've got on the screen here, each of these is consistent across the different sectors that we're talking about. So we'll go into a couple of these points specifically and how these challenges can be faced.
Yeah, so looking at data quality, obviously we know the criticality of that. If there is poor data from the outset, I mean, the impact of that can have significant cost implications. If we look at the healthcare sector, it can be, implications around particular procedure. So quality is absolutely critical, as we know. Looking at companies now in industry, they're evolving in terms of the data storage and the amount of digital data. So there's much more of a significance around the scalability and the infrastructure that's in place. Obviously, there's a high load that's placed on these infrastructures, and with that, especially at the likes of an NHS trust that might have 5,000 staff users on the system, it puts a high significance on that. And on that particular point, data integration, we look at legal sector. I mean, I'm working with a legal organisation who've been on the acquisition trail. They have acquired 3 organisations in the past 12 months, and with that comes a challenge and a complexity in the way that they manage data and the frameworks and structures they've got in place. So with that, they're looking at integration after data alignment has taken place. But ultimately, there is a real challenge there around how that's managed.
And I think we've seen that ourselves, haven't we, Andy, with, for a company ourselves that have grown significantly over the last 2 years. And we've incorporated about 30 different organisations into our business as Oasis. So we're quite familiar with this growing scalability of a business and the incorporation of different databases and software. So, I think it just shows that it is across a lot of different sectors, and the oil and gas sector is no different to that. I mean, there's ever changing requirements, acquisitions, data migrations and merges that we see.
Yeah, data retention and lifecycle management is an interesting point. If we look particularly at the NHS, I mean, they have obviously policies in place, but when we look at, individual case records, there could be an individual document that might have one retention period, whereas another has, a much greater retention period. So a hip operation needs to be, and documentation relating to that needs to be retained for 15 years, whereas a patient that's had a blood transfusion, documentation relating to that is 25 years. So that poses a real challenge to how that's managed internally by these organisations, and a lot of them will take, a risk-based approach. It's obviously the balance between maintaining compliance, but also there's a consideration of cost, time, and effort, and that all leads into the decisions that they take. One of the challenges around the data and the analytics of information, there's these quantities of data sets and systems, and as we said, if you acquire an organisation, inherit the data set, it's trying to then work with that data. How can that be that information be extracted in order that it's usable to make informed decisions?
Yeah, and I think it's not only making it usable, it's that element of compliance as well, isn't it? And making sure that we're compliant and we're moving forward with the regulatory changes. It's a fast-paced industry and technologies are forever changing. Compliance guidelines are forever changing, and it's keeping up to speed with that. I think within the data management culture, there are potentially skill gaps within different organisations and sectors where, many organisations will face a gap in terms of data management resource, budgets, facilities, and that's something that we're all facing the struggle of. So the consequences of poor data management as well. We're all significantly aware of the issues that could be faced if we aren't working to our data management guidelines. From an oil and gas sector point of view, that can be a risk to mechanical operational failures, risks to compliance when it comes to regulatory fines that might be enforced. So the importance of having accurate data that's accessible and visible to the various departments within an organisation, you know, is significantly important to maintain an effective working environment.
Yeah, and looking at the medical sector, I mean, again, you know, absolutely critical, as I mentioned early on. You know, it might mean that, you know, a patient procedure can't go ahead. It might mean that a consultant surgeon's working with inaccurate data, patient safety and risk all comes into play. But I mean, look at another point. I was reading some information around a particular instance of poor data management, and within the NHS, every single procedure is coded, which links to a tariff, and just through inaccuracies of how that data is recorded on its clinical code, you know, that leads to a shortfall in revenue within the NHS of approximately £400,000 per annum, and that's just one micro element. And conversely, looking at the legal sector, I've mentioned about the wet signatures and the reliance and the importance of those. But certain documents, you know, they can be digitised within that industry, and we've seen and heard of instances whereby law firms have digitised records, but not in line with British and European standards. So there's a particular standard, which is BS 10008, and that is for legal admissibility of electronic information. And we found that legal companies have scanned documents not to that standard, and it's ultimately put particular cases at risk. So again, really important to consider, you know, what seems like, you know, a really, you know, a strong route going forward. There might be a commercial reason behind it to digitize internally, but it's a key focus to make sure that it's all being completed in alignment with standards in the relevant areas.
Yeah, and I think, you know, like you've just said, Andy, each of these sectors has its areas where there has been, I suppose, news headline projects or issues or data projects that haven't gone as planned, and where these fines have been put in place or commercial risks have been noticed. You know, compliance regulations, I think things are ever changing again on this one, but there's a lot of consistencies when we look at this list. Yeah,
so if we look at each of the sectors, obviously we're governed by GDPR and all the regulations that poses, and ultimately the ICO, as we know, is the governing body there that can potentially issue, distribute fines if we're not in accordance to if we're not working in accordance to regulations. I mean, there's been some pretty horrifying stories. If we take, for example, the healthcare, where there's been a significant amount of data on unencrypted USB drives that have been left in the public domain, and that's ultimately led to significant fines by the ICO. But looking at other frameworks that are listed, so NHS Digital and the Data Protection and Security Toolkit within the healthcare sector, I mean, these are frameworks and good practice guidelines that, you know, ultimately need to be adhered. Conversely, in the legal sector, the SRA, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, I mean, they have significant powers, as it were. So if they were investigating a legal organisation, they have the ability to come in and ultimately take ownership and cease all documentation. If we go back 10 years, I worked for a company who stored records for a particular legal company that was being investigated, and they basically turned up unannounced and said, we need 5,000 boxes of data extracting now, which obviously was a challenge. We managed to come up with a compromise, but again, it just emphasises the importance around, you know, maintaining, meeting these guidelines, and also having availability and accessibility to the data when required.
And I think meeting these guidelines is something that, you know, again, falls in the oil and gas sector as well, meeting the guidelines that are requested by the NSTA. we're fully aware of projects such as abandonment data requests, Southern North Sea data requests that are, guiding the operators in a way of being compliant with the data that's being uploaded into regulatory body systems. But I think internal compliance as well is a key factor on a lot of these. If you're looking at GP offices, legal firms, and different operators, we all have our own internal compliance. I think, you mentioned the SRA there as well. We've got the OSDU from terms of the energy sector and looking at a common data platform enabling consistent data being produced and uploaded. The system's changed. There's always things to keep up to date with on anything like this. And it's just making sure we are aware and we're keeping up to date with the requirements that are placed upon the different companies that we're working for. So, how can we share the knowledge that we've got from these different sectors? What do each of these sectors face in terms of challenges, and where do we feel? And this is purely from our perspective of working within these different sectors of what do we feel as a service company, as a supplier, that these sectors are doing well at and other areas could learn from. And I think from an oil and gas point of view, we're extremely good at managing large volumes of data, significantly large volumes of data when it comes to seismic, like Don was talking in the earlier presentations, marine surveys, and how we manage those and the metadata that's surrounding those. But then potentially when it comes to things like retention plans, document retention plans, it's a struggle within the industry of getting approvals to destroy that data once it comes to the end of its retention plan. And that's sometimes a mixture of reasons. It could be a financial, commercial reason of, the budget's just not there to destroy it. And it might versus the cost of retaining it on shelf, does it pay off? But also, does that individual want to click that button and say, yes, destroy? And I think that's a factor that we face quite a lot within the oil and gas sector is no one wants to press that button and say, yes, destroy. A lot of this data, once it's gone, and it would be a substantial financial impact if it was had to go and acquire new data. And, you can never acquire the exact same data from the exact same well on the whole. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and looking at the healthcare sector here, I mean, the data flow between the primary care and secondary care, so i.e. GP practices through to the NHS trusts. I mean, there's millions and millions of document transactions each day for each patient appointment, and they're both physically and digitally routed from multiple disparate systems. And, that ultimately is really efficient and effective, and how we're seeing that works in that particular industry. That these documents are routed to the right point at the right time. And I mean, one challenge that we're seeing is that they are slightly behind the curve on the digital strategy. We look at the healthcare sector, because ultimately there's a big commitment and a big financial outlay there, and a complexity to implementing such a full-on EDRMS approach. But what we have seen is that in the health sector, although there is creation of physical paper, it is very much reduced from where it was, whereby they'll be looking at other systems, how those systems, the data can be extracted. So let's just say it's a clinical system. What information can be gleaned from that, and how can that be then centralized in a repository? And conversely, on the legal piece, generally, there is a lot of metadata associated to each case and each matter and each client. This is, as I said earlier, housed in many systems. But the real challenge that they've got is when they need to pinpoint a specific document within a particular case file, given that it's very much physical, given that these case files can be very, very large, and when they need to hone into something specific, we see that as a real challenge. And ultimately, this is where the consideration comes in the legal sector, because digitisation piece, it's not just straightforward. It doesn't necessarily make financial sense if the wet signature is required. However, when you look at the inefficiencies of how they have to manage the physical data, it starts to generate a potential route forward there to consider. Okay, so looking at emerging trends, as we know, there's this desire to go digital. What we're seeing in the industries is that there's multiple systems from multiple departments, and they all serve a valid purpose, whether it be finance, HR, but ultimately they are looking to streamline that data into one overarching sort of single source of information, if you like, where that's possible. So, that could be that there's an overarching EDMS that sits on top, on the understanding that all the back-end systems are fit for purpose. That seems to be something that we're really, engaging with a lot of clients over. But also, if you look at automated workflows, we're seeing this even at document level. So it could be that there's particular documents within both sectors that are a particular pain point or an issue, or there's an inefficiency there. And what it might be is that, through the use of likes of Power Automate, that when that document is received from an external source, it's routed from department or individual A and then down to B and C. And that's what we're generally seeing, this granular approach, and certainly targeting those key documents there that cause a challenge. ESG, obviously a key kind of buzzword at the moment. I mean, as a supplier, we're inundated with ESG questionnaires that we have to evidence and show that how we as a business are trying to work with our clients in an environmentally friendly and sustainable manner. Again, something that we'd always advocate is looking at scan on demand and looking to digitize, but only when needed. Obviously, the challenge comes when there's clients that don't look to utilize that approach, and the physical approach is something that's still a requirement. However, we're looking at everything that we can, such as vehicles, and how we actually transport those documents, and looking at route planning. But ultimately, it is a real challenge for us, and I'm sure all organisations are in a similar position as well.
Yeah, and I think as we've discussed, Andy, the whole go digital.
Hi, it's Alan here. If you could start wrapping up, please, and so we've got time for some questions.
Yes, of course. I'll no problem. So yeah, I think the whole go digital, I think all of the points below really roll into that. They all need to play a part to get to that end goal of the going digital. I think, where should our efforts be focused? I think there's commercial considerations built into this. Where's the playoff between this of being compliant and also meeting budgets, and being realistic as well. I think quite often we're ticking the box of potentially compliance, but are we ticking the box that leads us to future projects such as machine learning, advanced technologies that are going to help us going forward? And I think it is that, making sure that we're not just ticking the box, but we're also helping pave a way for the future.
Yeah, utopia is obviously, to have everything digitized, but there's a real commercial consideration to this. Generally, what we're seeing is that, we're looking at the criticality of the documents, the activity on the documents, and then also the retention periods, and that helps make an informed decision on the actions that are taken. And we're seeing almost like the 80-20 split, where 80% on legacy data, if it's in physical form, keep it in that physical format, digitize what is required when needed, and then focus on day forward, whether that be through implementing or creating documents electronically at source or digitizing physical. Yeah, as we've said, the Big Bang approach is something that we're not seeing as the way forward across all industries. They're looking at honing in on those pain points. They're looking at systems that are already in place that fit for purpose. And I mentioned earlier around this overarching system and utilising the likes of Azure, Amazon Web Services in the back end, and all just this granular approach is what we're seeing across all industries. The big bang comes with cost and challenge and potentially presents risk, and we're really advocating the approach of maybe piloting in certain departments or certain areas of the business and then rolling out.
Yeah, so to wrap up the slide, so we've discussed the varying differences between the different sectors, but the similarity is the end goal is the same, and moving towards this more digital world and being compliant where we can. But like we've said, some of the industries, there's sectors that are doing things well at, and there's still challenges that others are facing. So how do we work within different industries? And I think conferences and seminars such as this are a good way of picking up what is happening in different industries. And there's a couple of other options as well that we've noted down here of areas where you can pick up different ideas and solutions. Pop our camera back on now, but if you've got any questions, feel free to send them through or feel free to ask away now. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that and the discussion around different industries. I'll start with a question of my own. What, in your experience, or I don't know what experience you have of artificial intelligence, machine learning in these areas, is anything much being applied in the medical and legal industries?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, it's quite key. I mean, if we're looking at, documents that are digitized and routing into an ultimate, end repository, which would be an EDRMS. I mean, the AI piece, and looking at, extracting key data and learning from that and how that's then routed to, as I say, the end destination. I mean, that's something that's key, but ultimately it kind of goes on in the background with these capture softwares that are now in place. I mean, they've got significant functionality. There's ultimately a setup and a configuration that's taken place, and there's a period of discovery and learning. But yeah, this is something that just goes on in the background, and it's software that we're working with as well.
Okay, Lewis has got a rather long thing in the chat, but I'll try and summarize it about sort of the going digital over the long term, and that people have an interest. And I think it's probably the same in medical and legal. They have an interest in a piece of data for a period of time, and once they've moved on to a different project, that's it. They're not interested in that data anymore. And he's saying, sort of maybe this is the stewardship aspect that a lot of data managers are trying to implement. You got any comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, over time, I mean, as we've said, there is, a key focus here on retaining the data that you need until, it's kind of exceeded its retention period. And I mean, that's something that, is built into, any project, looking at document types, looking at data tags and how that then can support, the retention management piece. And it's just something that's got to be done in that early stage of discovery. But as I say, if we look at the healthcare sector, there is this real challenge when you look at inquiries, they're sort of long-standing. There's a nervousness around, destroying data, whether it be physical or digital. It all presents a real challenge there. But again, it's just a lot of these things are all driven by, the data and the processes and the integration with other systems that help make those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, from a very personal perspective, I would say I've got evidence of the legal system and the medical system destroying records, which were probably still active. But I won't go into that in too much detail now. Well, certainly one of them was still active, and that was a court destroying records rather than a legal company. And the other one was, yes, the NHS destroying records of somebody who has been inactive, shall we say, for many years.
Okay.
So, you know, the courts are not very good either. So, you know, let alone the lawyers. Anyway, thanks for that.